What's up everybody, welcome back to another video. Today we'll be learning how to graph circles, and to graph circles we need to gather certain information from the equation given to us. And what we want to gather from the equation is the center point of the circle. We want to find the information that tells us that, and we also want to find the radius. So as we move on today's lesson, we'll see two equations that are the most commonly used when graphing circles, and we'll find out how to find the certain information from them. And as we move on, we see those two equations right here. X squared plus y squared equals r squared, and x minus h squared plus y minus k squared equals r squared. These are the two equations you'll be dealing with most commonly when graphing circles, and we're going to learn today how to gather the proper information for them to then graph the circle, So let's start off with our first equation, which is x squared plus y squared equals r squared. And we want to find the center point of the circle and the radius from looking at this equation. So let's start with the center point. Well, for equations that include x squared plus y squared, always like this on one side of the equation, the center point will always be 0, 0. If there's an x squared plus y squared only on one side of the equation, your center point for your circle will be 0, 0. Now that we found our center point, all we have to do is find the radius. And as you can see, x squared plus y squared is equal to r squared, which means whatever number x squared plus y squared is equal to, the square root of that number is your radius. So now that we found the center point and the radius by looking at this graph, by looking at this equation, we can graph our circle. Now as we move on to the second equation, it might seem a little bit more complex, but it's essentially the same thing. We just want to find the center point of our circle and our radius. And when given an equation such as this, our center point is actually, or C as we can say, is h comma k. The h representing the x value of our center point and the k representing the y value of our center point. But the h and the k are not the exact same as the ones given to you in your equation. In fact, they're actually the opposite. They're the opposite signs. And you can understand this by setting these two terms equal to 0. So for example, if you set x minus h equal to 0, and then you solve for x, you'd realize that the answer you get is the opposite sign of the h given to you in the equation. And it's the same thing for when you're solving for y. So when you want to find your h and k values, just basically remember you can set your terms, your x minus h term and y minus k term equal to 0 to understand it, but all you have to do is just use the opposite sign of them given to you, and we'll elaborate that later on in the lesson. And now we want to find our radius, which is essentially the same thing. Since this side of the equation is set equal to r squared, we just find the square root of this number, and that is our radius. So now that we've learned how to gather the proper information from these two equations, let's move on to today's actual lesson. And in today's actual lesson, we will be going over a couple of problems, all of which deal with several different situations. And remember, if you feel free to try these problems on your own if you want to have at it. It's always good to try and practice problems on your own. And with that, let's move on to problem number 1. And here we have it. X squared plus y squared equals 9. Now remember, as we were talking about the first equation right here, whenever you have x squared plus y squared only on one side of the equation, your center point will always be 0, 0. So now we know that the center point for our circle in this problem is 0, 0. So now that we know that, let's just put a point on the graph for that. Okay, and now we want to find our radius. And remember, our radius is essentially the number on the right side, or whatever x squared plus y squared is equal to, the square root of that. So that would be the square root of 9, which equals 3, which equals r. So that's why our radius is 3 for this. And what that essentially means is from the center point, we're going to be going 3 right, up, left, and down. That's where we're going to put our last 4 points. And remember, the radius is the distance from the edge of the circle to the center point of the circle. So now that we have all the points on our graph, with each of these 4 points being 3 units, let's say, from the center point, all we have to do is just fill in our graph by drawing a circle, and there we go. That is what our circle looks like for this problem. So now that we've done this problem, let's move on to problem number 2. And over here we see it's x minus 1 squared plus y plus 1 squared equals 16. Now this is a problem dealing with the second equation we discussed. Okay, well, let's start. First, we want to find the center point. And to find the center point, we want to look at the h and k values. But remember, we want to use the opposite signs of the h and k values given to us. So the center point would actually be 1, -1. And once again, to make sure that it makes sense to you guys, all we want to do is set these two terms, x minus 1 and y plus 1 equal to 0. So if we set x minus 1 equal to 0, we get x equals +1. And if we do the same thing for the y, we get y plus 1 equals 0, and then we get y equals -1. So now that we have x equals 1 and y equals -1, we now know that our center point for our circle in this problem is 1, -1. And now that we found the center point, all we have to do is find the radius, which would just be the square root of 16, since that is the number the left side of the equation is set equal to. And that is just 4, which means 4 is our radius for this problem. So now that we found the radius and the center point, let's just put those points on the graph. So the center point is 1, -1, so it's right over here. And now that we know the radius, we just go for right, up, left, and down. Now that we have our points in the general area of what they're supposed to go, 4 units away in each direction from the center point, all we have to do is just graph our circle. It's going to look something like this. A little bit neater, but something like this. And that's our circle for this problem. So now let's move on to problem number 3, which is the same format as the last problem, but with different numbers. So let's do this real quick. Let's do this, guys. So what we want to do is find the center point first, which means we have to look at the h and k values. And it's the opposite sign, so that means our center point for this problem would actually be -3, +2. So let's put that on our graph real quick. Okay. Now let's find the radius, which is just this number squared. So that's the square root of 4, which is 2, which is our radius. Okay. So now that we know our radius, let's plot the rest of these points on our graph. Okay, now that we have the rest of these points on our graph, all we have to do is graph our circle, which is going to look something like this. There we go, that's our circle for problem number 3, and with that we move on to problem number 4. And this is where it starts to get a little tricky. As you can see in this example, instead of being given an equation that we have to gather information from, we're just given c 0, 1 and r equals 3. Well, if you look closely at this, you'll realize it's actually even easier to do it than when given an equation. And that's because we're already given the equation we're already given the information we're trying to find. We're given the center point and the radius. We're given both of these 2 bits of information that we need to use to graph our circle. So instead of finding them, we can just use these. So we know that our center point is 0, 1. So let's just plot that on our graph. We have 0, 1 right here. And now that we know that we have a radius of 3, we can put the rest of these points on our graph. Let's get all these over here. Okay, now that we have all our points on the graph, all we have to do is just graph our circle. And that is what our circle looks like for problem number 4. Now we move on to problem number 5, and this is by far the trickiest problem we're going to go over in today's lesson. But it's good to know how to solve these type of problems because you might face them later on. And this is when you're given a problem such as x squared plus y squared plus 2x minus 4y minus 11 equals 0. It has to be set to 0. Okay, so this definitely looks a bit more complex than the problems we've been dealing with, but we essentially just have to rearrange this and simplify in a way that results to the equations we have been dealing with. So first, what we want to do when given a problem with these sort of numbers or terms or variables is you want to rearrange it so that the common variables are next to each other. And what that means is you sort of want to rearrange it like this. For an example, in this example, we want to make it x squared plus 2x plus y squared minus 4y minus 11 equals 0. So that we rearrange it so that the common variables are next to each other in this order. This is where the essential step comes, the big part of graphing circles for when given equations such as this. This is the big step, and what we want to do is basically complete the square. Notice how we have an x squared plus a 2x over here and a y squared minus 4y over here. You remember we see something sort of like this when completing the square, which means we want to find that box value. You want to find that other value that can make these two into perfect trinomials. We want to find the third value that can make this into a term that can be squared, which equals this. And what I mean is we can basically split these into two different parts. We can split x squared plus 2x and y squared minus 4y. And now we want to find the third value. So if we add the third value to the x squared and 2x, we can factor it so that we get the same term squared. And you guys did learn this in fact, or when doing completing the square. And the formula we want to use when doing this is b over 2 squared. So using this formula, we want to find the third value for x squared plus 2x and y squared minus 4y. So let's do that. So in x squared plus 2x, we have 2 over 2 squared, which is just 1, actually. And over here, for y squared minus 4y, we have negative 4 over 2 squared, which is just 4. So now remember, like we did in completing the square, when we add a 4 and a 1 to this side, we also add it to the other side. So we'd have x squared plus 2x plus 1 plus y squared minus 4y plus 4 minus 11 equals 0. But remember, when we do add the 1 and 4 on both sides, we also want to add 1 and 4 on this side. So this would actually be equal to 0 plus 1 plus 4. Now remember, we can also add 11 to both sides, so let's just do that real quick. So now we have x squared plus 2x plus 1 plus y squared minus 4y plus 4 equals. And now that we've added 11 to both sides, we get 11 plus 4 plus 1, which equals 16. And now just to make sure you guys did understand it, let's just go back to our steps and see what we did. Since we've rearranged this as x squared plus 2x plus y squared minus 4y minus 11 equals 0, we notice that we can complete the square for both of these two. And if after we completed the square using b over 2 squared, which is the formula, we got 1 and 4. So now we added 1 and 4 to both sides as we did over here. And we also added 11 since this number is on both sides. So we added 11 to both sides and we ended up like this, with x squared plus 2x plus 1 plus y squared minus 4y plus 4 equals 16. Now remember the purpose of completing the square. It's to end up with a good factor. It's to end up with the same factor. So if you can once again split this in a sense. You can split these two parts and you see, well, x squared plus 2x plus 1. You can actually factor that into x plus 1 squared. So now that we made our perfect trinomial into a squared, we've made it squared, which is the same term. We can do the same for this side too. Y squared minus 4y plus 4 can be factored into y minus 2 squared. And that's equal to 16. Well, if you look closely, this is the same format as the equations we've been dealing with. X plus 1 squared plus y minus 2 squared equals 16. Now, as you get more used to doing this, you can actually skip this step right here. And since you know how to factor, you can just immediately go from this step to this step. And after seeing that these are perfect trinomials, you can factor them into these same terms squared. And you can make them into this thing we have right here. In this example, we made it x plus 1 squared plus y minus 2 squared. And now that we have the equation we've been working with in pretty much this whole lesson, we can find our center point and our radius. So our center point would be -1, comma, +2. And our radius would be the square root of 16, which equals 4. So now that we have our center point and radius, let's put the points on the graph. So our center point is at -1, comma 2, and we have a radius of 4. And now that we have all of these points on the graph, all we have to do is graph our actual circle. It's going to look something like this. Now this definitely was a tricky problem, and I hope you guys did understand it. So as you can see, we learned how to graph circles today by looking at these two equations at the top right here, which were x squared plus y squared equals r squared, and x minus h squared plus y minus k squared equals r squared, we figured out how to graph our circles and rearrange our equations in a way to then graph our circles. So I hope from this lesson you guys did learn how to graph circles, and if you did, please consider subbing to the channel, and also make sure to check out our playlist on math. Thank you for watching.